So you can see that some faces are presented briefly, so one on either side of the screen.
Very briefly, that's like less than a second?
Well, actually, some of the time they're presented for a quarter of a second and sometimes for a full second. So that way we can disentangle whether things are happening quickly or slowly, basically. So the one thing you'll notice is there's always a neutral face on one side, and on the other side there's either an angry face, so negative information, or a happy face, a positive information. Once the faces disappear, a probe appears. So this is a square or a diamond, and the participant's task is simply to indicate whether the probe is a square or a diamond, just with a key press. So we can use their response times to measure what they're doing with their attention. So if attention shifts to the emotional face, you'd expect their response times to be quicker when the probe is presented in the place previously occupied by the emotional. Yeah, exactly. What we've found in this experiment is that frontal asymmetry, the mark of a vulnerability to depression, seems to relate to attentional biases. You noted before that the faces is there sometimes very briefly or sometimes for a longer period of time. So what we find is that the relationship between frontal asymmetry and biased attention to negative information doesn't happen when the faces are presented very briefly, but it emerges when the face is there for a longer period of time. So people who look like they're vulnerable to depression based on the EEG measures seem to dwell on negative information.
The experiment that you've just seen is actually now used clinically in a number of studies where and starting to be used in practice, where you can train people to preferentially attend to the happy face. So you can do a version of the experiment where one face is always angry and one face is always happy, and you can have the target always appear behind the happy face. And if you do that several hundred times, what you can do is eventually train people to, given two faces to choose from, always attend to the happy face. And so there are now a number of studies suggesting that this actually protects from depression and can be used in treatment for depression. It seems like such an incredibly simple thing. It's called cognitive bias modification, and is really not at all what we think of when we think of therapy for treatment of depression. It's just 10 minutes a day sitting down playing what is essentially is a video game. In fact, you can get it as an iPhone app. But it's this idea that instead of talking about training people to think about their moods or their emotion, to train people to attend to positive information in the environment, and that the mood effects would flow on from there. That if you can control thought, then the emotion will fall out of that naturally.
That suggests that all the setting up of pathways is not hardwired at any time in life, really, that there's scope for that to maybe not shift entirely, but to deal with it differently.
We would like to think so. We used to have this idea that adult brains were entirely set in stone, and that's clearly wrong. Our brains are adapting on the fly all the time, and this might be an example of that.
My name's Jessica Clifton, and I'm another PhD student of Gina Grimshaw's, and basically you've just heard a little bit about cognitive bias modification, and I do something very similar, except this time I use words. I'm quite interested in the processes involved in interpretation, especially when we're concerned with emotional ambiguity.
So we've got a sentence here up on screen saying your partner has something to tell you, which I guess to some people means there's something bad coming up.
Exactly. So
some would expect perhaps a positive surprise.
Yeah. So as mentioned before, individuals with depression and individuals with anxiety as well have negative cognitive biases. And one of these negative cognitive biases that has been observed is a negative interpretation of emotional ambiguity, particularly in language. So in terms of cognitive bias modification, we found that we can actually train healthy individuals to show similar biases to those observed in individuals with depression and anxiety. The training programs that have been developed for use in clinical populations, they tend to train people with depression or anxiety away from the negative interpretation biases that we know exist. However, I'm interested in looking at these processes in healthy people. Can we induce similar interpretive biases in individuals that don't have depression or anxiety? And what does this really tell us about what we're really changing, and how can we better develop programs So we use a lot of ambiguous words with a negative and a neutral meaning. So for example, the ambiguous word patient could be negatively associated, such as patient in a hospital, or neutral as in you're a patient person. And we're interested in the meanings that people go on to select after they've been given training.
Ideally, you'd want to be able to do it in reverse, though.
Definitely.
It would be a nice thing to know what goes on when you train somebody to think more negatively or to expect more negative outcomes or make more negative associations.
Yeah.
That would suggest that you can do it backwards as well.
Exactly. And it has been done, but it always comes back to what are we actually changing and what's actually going on underneath. And perhaps one way to do this is to start examining healthy people and what changes actually go forth, so that hopefully we can come out of it with a better understanding and develop better programs.
The interpretation of emotional ambiguity is another form of cognitive bias modification that has been used clinically. So to train people to take these ambiguous sorts of sentences or ambiguous scenarios and interpret them in more positive sorts of ways to see if that carries over with some degree of success. Our research certainly has implications for how we do that, but we're also really interested in the fundamental mechanisms that allow that to happen. And so by doing it in a controlled laboratory environment where we can see if we can push these biases around, then we can start to actually manipulate things. So there's lots of different cognitive processes involved in interpreting an ambiguous situation, and we can figure out which of the ones we're able to target with our training mechanism by doing these different types of experiments. The program of research that we've been describing so far is looking how this characteristic pattern of brain activity is associated with different types of emotional processing in this predicted way. So we've picked up on the idea that the types of emotional processing differences we see in these people is consistent with the theories that would say that they're negatively biased in how they process information. But essentially, we're still looking at a correlation. We're correlating a pattern of brain activity with a particular type of emotional responding. And scientifically, we could make a much stronger case that the left and right frontal cortical areas play an important role in that if I could actually manipulate them directly. And so that's what the new toy here is. This is a transcortical direct current stimulation system, or a TDCS. It's really actually very low tech. All it is 2 electrodes, an anode and a cathode that are going to run a very, very small 2 milliamp current across your brain. And you can run it for about 10 minutes. And the effect of it is that under the anode, you get an upregulation of neural activity, and under the cathode, you get a downregulation of neural activity. We think what it's actually doing is causing very slight metabolic changes that cause a slight depolarization of membranes, which makes them just a little bit more excitable. So essentially things flow a little nicer in that particular area of cortex. So if we upregulate that left frontal area that we think is really important for emotional control, now do we start to see changes in people's emotional responding. So that's a much more direct causal way of looking at the relationship between left and right frontal brain activity and emotional responding.
Ultimately, I guess your hope would be to prevent, treat depression?
Well, I should add that this TCDS is part of a family of other forms of brain stimulation that are now actually being used in treatment of depression, particularly in depression that's resistant to SSRI treatment, with a certain degree of success. But again, we don't know exactly how it works or why it works. And so what we're trying to do is get at those mechanisms of what exactly is it doing to your cognition when it's producing that effect. But there's been a number of recent meta-analyses suggesting that there's a small, or at least equivalent to pharmacological effect on the treatment of depression itself. Ultimately, what I would love to see is prevention of depression. So depression is a huge problem in the world. World Health Organization ranks it as the leading cause of disability in middle and high income countries. So it's a huge problem, and whatever we're doing to treat it is not working particularly well. Most people don't get treatment at all. And so I think prevention would be the way to go. So by understanding those early childhood mechanisms, as well as cognitively what's going on, we might be able to develop training programs that could teach our children and our young adults, and all of us at any point in our life, to be able to train up cortex so that it can better regulate emotional responding, or even learn sort of broader, more general strategies of emotion regulation, for example. If we focused on that during the education of our children, for example, to include emotional regulation and control as an important part of education, I think would be a really valuable thing to do as well.
That was Gina Grimshaw, a cognitive neuroscientist at Victoria University. You also heard her students Michael Turley, Josh Foster and Jessica Clifton.
That's all for now. For more, check us out on the web, radionz.co.nz/Our Changing World. Kia ora mai.